What if the mind you trust to make your most important decisions, the one guiding your investments, your career moves, your relationships, and your judgments about other people, is operating on a set of deeply embedded shortcuts that were never designed for the complexity of the modern world? And what if those shortcuts are producing costly, systematic errors that you are almost entirely incapable of detecting from the inside? Daniel Kahneman is not a motivational author. He is a Nobel Prize-winning psychologist who spent his entire career studying the gap between how humans believe they think and how they actually do. What he found in that gap is both fascinating and quietly terrifying. Thinking, Fast and Slow was published in 2011, and it immediately became one of the most important books ever written about the human mind, not because it introduced a new philosophy, but because it did something far more confronting. It produced the scientific evidence. Kahneman spent decades running controlled experiments that revealed, with rigorous precision, the exact mechanisms to which intelligent, educated, experienced people consistently make irrational decisions and then construct perfectly logical explanations for why those decisions were correct. This book does not just describe bias, it shows you the architecture of your own irrationality in enough detail that you cannot ignore it afterward. There is a question this book opens that will not be fully answered until the very end of this breakdown, and it is the question that makes this one of the most financially consequential books ever written for anyone who handles money, leads people, or makes decisions under uncertainty. That question is this: if your most important decisions feel rational and well-reasoned in the moment, how would you ever know when you are wrong? Hold that. And before we go any further, subscribe to the Book Vault and hit the like button right now. This channel exists to give ambitious thinkers the strategic edge that most people never find because they never look in the right places. Now let us go inside the mind. The two systems, System 1 and System 2. The architecture that organizes this entire book is introduced immediately, and it is one of the most useful mental models ever developed for understanding human behavior in high-stakes environments. We begin with the foundational framework Kahneman calls System 1 and System 2. Two distinct modes of thinking that operate simultaneously inside every human mind, governing everything from split-second instincts to deliberate analytical reasoning. Understanding this framework does not just make you a better thinker. It makes you a fundamentally more dangerous observer of your own decision-making, and that self-awareness is worth more in financial and strategic contexts than almost any other cognitive tool available. System 1 is the fast mind. It operates automatically, effortlessly, and continuously, running in the background of every waking moment. System 1 is what allows you to read these words without consciously decoding each letter, recognize a friend's face in a crowd, or feel immediate unease when someone's tone does not match their words. It is ancient, rapid, associative, and extraordinarily efficient. It is also the source of nearly every cognitive bias Kahneman spent his career documenting. System 1 does not reason. It recognizes patterns, fills in gaps, and delivers confident conclusions with no awareness of what it might have missed or distorted in the process. System 2 is the slow mind. It is deliberate, effortful, and sequential. When you calculate a complex multiplication problem in your head, draft a strategic argument, or carefully weigh the pros and cons of a major financial decision, you're engaging System 2. The critical detail Kahneman reveals is this: System 2 is lazy. It is metabolically expensive, and the brain resists deploying it when System 1 offers a faster, more comfortable alternative. This means that in most real-world situations, including negotiations, investment decisions, hiring judgments, and risk assessments, System 1 does the actual deciding while System 2 constructs a rational justification afterward. You feel like you reasoned your way to the conclusion. You did not. Most people think confidence is evidence of accuracy. In reality, confidence is almost entirely a product of System 1, and System 1 is equally confident whether it is right or catastrophically wrong. This is the first quiet earthquake of the book, and what Kahneman reveals in the chapters that follow explains exactly why smart people consistently make predictable, avoidable mistakes in exactly the situations where the stakes are highest. Cognitive ease, and the illusions of truth. We move now into a chapter that reveals one of the most commercially exploited and least understood mechanisms in human psychology, what Kahneman calls cognitive ease, and its role in creating powerful illusions about truth, familiarity, and trustworthiness. The insight here is precise and immediately applicable to anyone who makes decisions in markets, organizations, or relationships. Cognitive ease is the feeling of effortless processing, the mental sensation that something is familiar, clear, and unambiguous. When your brain encounters a stimulus it can process easily, it generates a subtle feeling of comfort that is neurologically indistinguishable from the feeling of encountering something true. Kahneman documents this effect across dozens of experiments. Statements printed in clear, high-contrast font are rated as more credible than identical statements in difficult-to-read fonts. Companies with easily pronounceable names consistently outperform companies with complex names in their early trading periods after IPO. A message repeated multiple times becomes more persuasive, not because the logic improves, but purely because familiarity feels like truth. This is not a marginal effect. It is a robust, replicable, and powerful distortion of judgment that operates below the threshold of conscious awareness in virtually every human being tested. The financial implications of cognitive ease are staggering and almost entirely invisible to the people experiencing them. Investors systematically favor stocks of companies they've heard of, even when the underlying fundamentals of less familiar companies are demonstrably superior. Consumers pay premium prices for brands whose names feel smooth and familiar, regardless of product quality. Leaders make decisions based on proposals that are clearly presented over proposals that are analytically superior but harder to parse. The mechanism in every case is identical. Ease of processing generates a feeling of rightness that System 1 treats as evidence of quality, and System 2 rarely bothers to check. The dangerous misconception most people carry after learning about cognitive ease is that awareness of it provides protection from it. In reality, knowing that cognitive ease distorts judgment does not prevent it from distorting yours. The bias operates at a level that conscious awareness cannot reach. What it does provide is a behavioral strategy deliberately slow down when something feels intuitively obvious, when a decision feels unusually clear, or when a source feels immediately trustworthy. That friction is the only reliable defense System 2 has against System 1's most seductive illusions, answering, availability, and the biases that control decisions. Now we enter the chapter that documents the two most financially consequential cognitive biases in Kahneman's entire body of research, and understanding them changes the way a strategically aware person navigates every negotiation, every market decision, and every risk assessment they will ever encounter. We arrive at the anchoring effect and the availability heuristic, two System 1 shortcuts that silently distort judgment in opposite directions with equal reliability and almost no conscious awareness on the part of the person experiencing them. Both of these biases are operating in your decision-making right now, today, in ways that are costing you money, accuracy, and strategic clarity. The anchoring effect describes the human brain's powerful tendency to rely disproportionately on the first piece of numerical information encountered when making subsequent estimates or decisions. In one of Kahneman's most striking demonstrations, participants who spun a wheel that randomly landed on 65 subsequently estimated the percentage of African nations in the United Nations as significantly higher than participants whose wheel landed on 10, even though everyone knew the wheel was random. The first number contaminated the estimate anyway. In negotiations, the first offer anchors the entire subsequent conversation. In markets, the price at which you first encountered an asset anchors your perception of its value indefinitely. The availability heuristic operates through a different mechanism but produces equally systematic distortions. System 1 estimates the probability of an event based on how easily examples of it come to mind rather than on actual statistical frequency. Plane crashes are overestimated as causes of death because they are vivid, dramatic, and heavily covered by media. Car accidents are underestimated because they are mundane and routine. This same mechanism causes investors to overweight recent market events when making forward projections, causes leaders to overestimate risks they have personally experienced, and causes almost everyone to dramatically misjudge probabilities in domains where the memorable examples are emotionally charged. What comes next is the part of this book that most people never even reach, because Kahneman turns these two biases from theoretical observations into a practical diagnostic framework for identifying the precise moments in your own decision-making when System 1 is most likely to be running unchecked. Those moments share a common signature: high emotional salience, time pressure, and an absence of base rate data. Learn to recognize that signature, and you have identified the exact conditions under which your judgment is least reliable and most confident simultaneously. Overconfidence and the planning fallacy. We arrive now at the chapter that Kahneman himself has identified as the single most important practical insight in the entire book for anyone operating in business, finance, or leadership, and he calls it the overconfidence effect in the planning fallacy. This is the chapter that answers why intelligent, experienced, Motivated people consistently underestimate how long projects will take, how much they will cost, and how many obstacles will arise between conception and completion. The answer is not incompetence. It is a structural feature of how System 1 generates optimistic forward projections by focusing on the most favorable interpretation of available information while systematically ignoring the base rates that would correct those projections toward reality. The planning fallacy, as Kahneman defines it, is the universal human tendency to make decisions based on the best-case scenario rather than the statistical distribution of outcomes for similar endeavors in the past. When asked how long a project will take, most people construct a narrative of smooth execution and estimate accordingly. They almost never ask the statistically relevant question, how long did similar projects actually take for other people? That base rate data is available, accessible, and almost never consulted. The optimistic narrative is not dishonest. It is simply the natural output of a System 1 that is more fluent with stories than with statistics. This is where most people destroy their financial projections, their business timelines, and their investment theses before they even begin executing them. Kahneman documents study after study showing that professional forecasters in domains ranging from construction to venture capital consistently produce estimates that would require near-perfect conditions to achieve, then watch their actual outcomes cluster around the statistical average for their industry, which is frequently far below their projections. The gap between the inside view, my plan under my circumstances, and the outside view, what actually happens to people attempting this type of plan, is one of the most reliable and expensive gaps in all of human cognition. The correction Kahneman offers is called reference class forecasting. Before finalizing any important projection, deliberately seek out the base rate for your reference class, the population of projects, businesses, or endeavors most similar to yours, and weight your estimate toward that distribution rather than toward your internal narrative. This feels pessimistic from the inside. It is not. It is simply the substitution of statistical reality for optimistic fiction. And it is the single most reliable way to improve the accuracy of forward projections in any domain where System 1's optimism is structurally guaranteed to mislead you. Prospect theory and the psychology of loss. Now we reach the chapter at the emotional center of this entire book. The discovery that earned Kahneman his Nobel Prize in economics and permanently altered the field of behavioral finance, and it is called prospect theory. This is the chapter that explains, with mathematical precision, why human beings make systematically irrational decisions when money, risk, and potential loss are involved. And the insight here does not just describe a quirk of human behavior. It explains the invisible force behind some of the most costly financial decisions that intelligent people make repeatedly across their entire lives, from holding losing investments too long to abandoning winning ones too early. Prospect theory begins with a simple but devastating observation. Losses and gains are not psychologically symmetrical. The emotional pain of losing $100 is approximately twice as powerful as the emotional pleasure of gaining $100. This asymmetry, which Kahneman and his longtime collaborator Amos Tversky documented across hundreds of experiments, means that humans are not rational maximizers of expected value. They are loss avoiders operating under a psychological calculus that is systematically biased away from objective probability and toward the avoidance of regret. That bias produces patterns of financial behavior that are both predictable and self-destructive. Loss aversion explains why investors hold declining stocks far longer than any rational analysis would support, hoping to avoid the psychological pain of realizing a loss. It explains why people accept unfavorable terms in negotiations to avoid the feeling of losing ground, even when walking away would produce a superior objective outcome. It explains why businesses continue pouring resources into failing projects, because stopping feels like losing what was already invested. Kahneman calls this last pattern the sunk cost fallacy, and its grip on human decision-making is so powerful that even people who can articulate the fallacy perfectly continue to fall prey to it in practice. And this is where human nature becomes genuinely dangerous in financial context specifically, because loss aversion is not a personal weakness. It is a universal feature of human cognition that operates with equal force regardless of intelligence, experience, or financial sophistication. The research shows that professional traders, experienced investors, and senior executives are all subject to loss aversion to approximately the same degree as financial novices. Awareness helps marginally. The only reliable protection is structural building decision frameworks and rules that force adherence to objective criteria before the emotional weight of potential loss activates and hijacks the judgment process entirely. The experiencing self versus the remembering self. We now enter one of the most philosophically rich and practically disruptive chapters in the entire book, a chapter that challenges the very foundation on which most people base their life decisions, and Kahneman calls this distinction the experiencing self versus the remembering self. The insight here operates at a deeper level than any of the biases discussed so far, because it does not just describe how we make decisions incorrectly. It describes how we evaluate our own lives incorrectly, and that misvaluation produces chronic patterns of choice that systematically deliver less satisfaction than they promise and more regret than they predict. The experiencing self is the self that actually lives through events in real time, moment by moment, sensation by sensation. The remembering self is the self that constructs a narrative afterward, assembles a story from selected highlights and lowlights, and then uses that story to evaluate whether the experience was good or bad. Kahneman demonstrates that these two selves frequently arrive at entirely different conclusions about the same experience. And here is the critical detail. When making future decisions, humans almost exclusively consult the remembering self. They choose based on memory and narrative, not based on the actual texture of lived experience. This produces the peak end rule, one of the most striking findings in the entire book. Kahneman's research shows that people's evaluation of an extended experience is determined almost entirely by its most intense moment and its final moment, with almost no weight given to the duration of the experience in between. A medical procedure that ends with reduced pain is remembered as significantly less unpleasant than an objectively shorter procedure that ends at peak pain, even when the total amount of pain experienced was greater in the first case. Duration neglect is not a marginal effect, it is a dominant one, reshaping the remembered quality of experiences completely independently of what was actually felt during them. The financial and strategic implications of this distinction are profound and largely unexplored by most decision-making frameworks. Investment strategies, career choices, and lifestyle decisions are almost all evaluated through the lens of the remembering self, which means they are evaluated through the lens of anticipated narrative rather than anticipated experience. The result is a chronic mismatch between what people choose in pursuit of a good memory and what would actually produce a good life as lived moment to moment. This is one of the most unsettling ideas in the book, because it suggests that optimizing for happiness as remembered and optimizing for happiness as experienced may require entirely different decisions. How noise and bias corrupt judgment at scale. We arrive now at the final chapter of the strategic breakdown, a chapter that takes everything Kahneman has built about individual cognitive error and scales it into the organizational and institutional level, revealing why the problem of flawed human judgment does not diminish when smart people gather in groups, but actually intensifies in ways that are both predictable and largely invisible to the organizations experiencing them. This chapter addresses what Kahneman calls noise, the random, unwanted variability in human judgment that compounds the damage of systematic bias and produces outcomes in courts, hospitals, corporations, and financial institutions that are far less consistent and far less rational than any of their participants would believe or accept if forced to examine the evidence directly. Bias, as Kahneman defines it in this context, is systematic error, the consistent pull of judgment in a predictable direction due to anchoring, loss aversion, availability, or any of the other cognitive shortcuts documented throughout the book. Noise is different. Noise is the variability in judgment that exists even among equally qualified people evaluating identical information under identical conditions. Two experienced judges give dramatically different sentences to defendants with identical criminal histories. Two trained underwriters assign wildly different risk assessments to identical insurance applications. Two seasoned doctors recommend entirely different treatment approaches for identical patients. This variability is not explained by expertise differences. It is the product of mood, context, recent experience, and countless other factors that should be entirely irrelevant to the decision. The false ending arrives here, precisely at this moment in the book, because the noise chapter appears to conclude with a depressing portrait of institutional irrationality and leaves the reader feeling that the scale of the problem makes it essentially unsolvable. But that is not where Kahneman actually lands. Beneath the documentation of noise and bias at institutional scale lies something genuinely actionable, a principle Kahneman calls decision hygiene. Just as physical hygiene does not require knowing which specific pathogen you are protecting against, decision hygiene does not require identifying which specific bias is corrupting which specific judgment. It requires building structures, checklists, blind evaluations, pre-mortems, and reference class data into the decision process itself so that the reliability of output improves even when the source of error remains unidentifiable. And this is where the answer to the question planted at the very beginning of this breakdown finally arrives. If your most important decisions feel rational and well-reasoned in the moment, how would you ever know when you are wrong? The answer Kahneman delivers is both humbling and clarifying. You almost certainly cannot know from the inside. The feeling of rationality is produced by System 1 and is completely uncorrelated with actual accuracy. The only reliable protection is external, structural, and procedural. Build decision frameworks before the decision arrives. Consult base rates before trusting your narrative. Seek dissenting perspectives before concluding you have the complete picture. The goal is not to eliminate bias. It is to build systems that produce better outcomes despite the bias that will always be present in every human mind, including yours. Key lessons and insights. The first lesson: your fast mind is in charge more than you know. The first lesson this entire book teaches, and the one that restructures every other insight that follows, is that System 1, the fast automatic associative mind, is not a backup processor that activates during emergencies. It is the primary operating system running almost every significant judgment, assessment, and decision you make, including the ones you believe you have reasoned through carefully. Kahneman's research is unambiguous on this point. System 2 is rarely the author of your conclusions. It is almost always the editor who arrives after the conclusion has already been written and tidies up the language to make it sound deliberate. The practical implication of this lesson is not to distrust your intuition entirely. Kahneman is careful to note that System 1 produces accurate, reliable judgments in domains where it has been trained through years of consistent, high-quality feedback. An experienced chess grandmaster's intuitive read of a board position is genuine expertise, not bias. The problem arises in domains where feedback is delayed, inconsistent, or absent, which describes virtually every significant financial, strategic, and leadership decision most people face. In those domains, the confident feeling of intuitive clarity is not a signal of accuracy. It is a warning signal that System 2 needs to be deliberately engaged before the conclusion is accepted. The second lesson: anchors are everywhere, and they are never neutral. The second lesson drawn from Kahneman's research on anchoring is one with immediate and compounding financial value for anyone who negotiates, prices, invests, or evaluates proposals in any professional context. The first number in any high-stakes conversation is never just a number. It is a gravitational field that pulls every subsequent estimate, counteroffer, and valuation toward its vicinity, regardless of whether it has any rational connection to the underlying reality being discussed. This is not a negotiating tactic that only works on the uninformed. Kahneman's research shows it works with full force on expert negotiators, experienced judges, and trained financial analysts. The practical application operates on two levels simultaneously. As the party making an offer, anchor first and anchor boldly, because the research shows that the party who sets the first number gains a structural advantage that persists throughout the entire negotiation regardless of subsequent moves. As the party receiving an offer, develop a specific counter-anchoring ritual before responding. Write down your own independently derived valuation before engaging with the number presented to you. Then negotiate from your number rather than from theirs. This single behavioral habit, practiced consistently, is one of the most financially valuable applications of the research in this entire book. The third lesson: loss aversion is costing you more than you realize. The third lesson embedded throughout Kahneman's work on prospect theory is the one with the most direct and quantifiable financial cost for the majority of people who encounter it. Loss aversion is not a character flaw. It is a biological feature of human cognition that served important evolutionary purposes and continues to operate with full force in financial environments where its effects are almost entirely counterproductive. The investor who holds a declining position because selling feels like accepting a loss, the entrepreneur who continues funding a failing venture because stopping feels like losing what was invested, the negotiator who accepts an unfavorable deal because walking away feels like conceding ground. All of them are paying the loss aversion tax repeatedly and often without any awareness that they are doing so. The structural protection Kahneman recommends is the pre-commitment of decision rules. Before entering any investment, define in advance the specific conditions under which you will exit, both on the upside and the downside, and commit to those conditions in writing before the emotional weight of potential loss becomes relevant. This technique works not because it eliminates loss aversion, but because it moves the decision to a moment when System 2 is available and unclouded by the immediate emotional pressure of watching a position move against you. The decision was made when you were rational. You are simply honoring it now. The fourth lesson. Overconfidence is the bias you cannot see in yourself. The fourth lesson woven through every chapter of this book, and the one that resolves one of the deepest tensions Kahneman's research creates, is that overconfidence is not a personality trait of arrogant or naive people. It is a universal product of System 1 operating in domains where genuine expertise has not been developed through consistent, high-quality feedback. The research shows that the confidence people feel about their judgments and predictions is almost entirely driven by the coherence of the story they have constructed, not by the actual reliability of that story. A compelling narrative feels true, and System 1 cannot distinguish between a compelling narrative and an accurate one. The behavioral correction is both simple and consistently underutilized. Before finalizing any significant projection, decision, or assessment, deliberately seek out the reference class. Find the population of situations most similar to yours and examine how the outcomes actually distributed across that population in the past. Then ask with genuine intellectual honesty whether you have specific, verifiable reasons to expect your outcome to fall in the top quartile of that distribution, or whether that expectation is primarily driven by the natural optimism of being the person closest to your own plan. In most cases, the honest answer to that question produces a more accurate forecast than any amount of additional analysis applied to the inside view alone. The fifth lesson, build decision systems, not just decision skills. The fifth and final lesson, which also answers the deepest question this book opens about the reliability of felt rationality, is the one that carries the most immediate practical value for anyone who makes high-stakes decisions in conditions of uncertainty. Individual decision skill, the ability to reason carefully, analyze evidence, and think critically, is necessary but structurally insufficient, because all of those skills operate through a mind that contains systematic biases, is subject to noise, and cannot evaluate its own reliability from the inside with any consistency. The solution is not to become a better reasoner in isolation. The solution is to build decision processes that produce better outcomes despite the limitations of the reasoner executing them. Decision hygiene, as Kahneman frames it, means introducing structural checkpoints before important decisions that slow down System 1, force engagement of System 2, and expose the judgment to information that would otherwise be ignored. Premortems, where you imagine the decision has failed and work backwards to identify why, are one of the most powerful and underused tools in this category. Blind evaluation processes, where the identity of the person or proposal being assessed is concealed during the initial evaluation, dramatically reduce the anchoring and availability distortions that contaminate most professional judgments. These structures do not make you a perfect decision maker. Nothing does. They make the process more reliable than any individual judgment could ever be on its own. The vault closing. There is a reason this book is used in business schools, policy institutes, military training programs, and investment firms across the world, and it is not because it is a pleasant read about human psychology. It is because Daniel Kahneman managed to do something genuinely rare in the literature of the mind. He translated decades of rigorous scientific research into a framework that is precise enough to be immediately actionable, honest enough to be genuinely confronting, and important enough that ignoring it carries a real and measurable cost for anyone who makes decisions under uncertainty, which is everyone, in every domain, every single day. The one action to take within the next 7 days is to run a premortem on the most important decision you are currently facing. Write down the decision at the top of a page. Then write this prompt. It is 12 months from now, and this decision has failed completely. Write down every reason you can generate for why that failure occurred. Do not filter for plausibility. Write everything System 2 can surface. Then read what you wrote and ask whether any of those failure modes changes your current approach. This single exercise, applied before the decision is finalized, surfaces the information that overconfidence, anchoring, and availability are most likely to suppress, and it does so at the only moment when that information can still change the outcome. The book vault exists to deliver exactly this kind of strategic intelligence, the ideas that change how you see the decisions you are already making before you realize a better framework was available. If this breakdown gave you even one insight that will make your thinking more accurate, your judgments more reliable, or your financial decisions more structurally sound, then it has done exactly what it was designed to do. Like this video, subscribe to the Book Vault, and drop your single most important takeaway in the comments below. You are not just watching a book breakdown. You are building the kind of mind that sees what most people miss, makes better decisions than most people make, and over time produces results that most people cannot explain. That is the real unfair advantage, and it starts here.